fellow Who-gazers, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the new podcast taking you through the world of the target novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. Welcome to episode 12, Doctor Who and the Cybermen. Before we get to the book, there was not a whole lot of Doctor Who news to discuss this week. We did lose one actor from a classic Doctor Who serial, Valentine Palmer, who played Monia in Day of the Daleks from 1972. We talked about the novelization of that story, Doctor Who and the Day of the Daleks by Terrance Dicks, several weeks ago. The character was called Moni in the novelization, M-O-N-I, and had a slightly different name for the televised version. A rumor also broke through certain less reputable corners of the Doctor Who news blogosphere that a particular former Doctor had been recast as Doctor Who number 14. As far as we can tell, this is a rumor from a Facebook page that got picked up by the wire services, but is not actually anything close to being a true story, so I don't plan on discussing it any further, unless of course there is a major casting announcement to come our way. So what we'll talk about this week is Doctor Who and the Cybermen. And as I've mentioned in several other places, such as the blog from which this podcast was born, Doctor Who Novels, Dr. Novels at WordPress.com. And as I also mentioned at length on the 2021 Trap 1 episode, a magazine-style episode featuring several different commentators talking about the target novelizations and what they mean to us, my own contribution was a discussion of how I came to collect Doctor Who novelizations in the first place and where I was when I bought this book for the first time. I'm not going to repeat the entire story here, although I will reference it on the interview later on in this episode, but do check out my blog or that episode of Trap 1 if you wish to hear more. My copy of Doctor Who and the Cybermen is the 5th printing from 1984. It has the red neon tube logo outlined in yellow, and it has the non-Chris Achilleos cover with 2 gold tinted Cybermen on the front. The back cover blurb is pretty interesting. A mystery virus is wreaking havoc among the crew of the Earth's weather control station on the moon. While investigations into the strange disease are in progress, International Space Headquarters Earth puts the entire moon base into strict quarantine, and the Doctor and his companions included. To make matters worse, moon base personnel inexplicably vanish, and vital weather control equipment is sabotaged. Who is responsible? The director of the base suspects the time travelers. The Doctor fears that the ruthlessly evil Cybermen are at work. ... This copy of the book is pretty beaten up and reflects my various phases of fandom over the years. I have the novelization pages marked off with the episode breaks / cliffhangers. So, for example, episode 4 begins on page 117, episode 3 begins on page 82, etc. If you hold the front cover of this book up to the light, I committed probably the cardinal sin of any collector. And at one point in the late 1980s, I used this book as a desk. I was playing a game of Stratomatic baseball, as you do, and I ended up leaning my paper score sheet on the front of this book. No, I have no idea what I was thinking. So if you hold the book at a certain angle, you can see the score of a game that I played between the 1982 New York Yankees and the 1982 Oakland A's. Steve McCatty pitched for Oakland and got shelled, as you can tell from the number of hash marks that I wrote under the hits allowed column. This is, I guarantee, the only Doctor Who book in my collection where the front cover features the remnants of writing on it. Again, I apologize to the gods of Doctor Who fiction. I have no idea what I was thinking. Coming up next, Doctor Who and the Cybermen. Let's get to it. Doctor Who and the Cybermen, televised as The Moon Base, written by Gerry Davis, from a teleplay by Kit Pedler and Gerry Davis, screen credit to Kit Pedler, televised in February and March 1967, published in February 1975. The original cover to Doctor Who and the Cybermen is notable for two reasons. First, it's the last novelization to use the original Target Doctor Who logo, nearly identical to the logo seen on screen with every story from An Unearthly Child up through the Moonbase itself. So this one story killed off the logo twice, once on TV and then in the book line. The other interesting thing about the cover is that it uses the wrong Cybermen. It uses the 1968 model from The Invasion, the current cyber costume in Doctor Who circles, at the time the book was published in early 1975, and which would be seen again a few weeks later on screen in Revenge of the Cybermen, but not the one used during the first three Troughton-era Cybermen adventures, including the adventure being novelized. The 1980s Target reprint cover corrects the look of the Cybermen. Unlike the picture on the first edition, this is the correct depiction of the Cybermen of the Moonbase, except that it makes them look gold instead of silver. Oh well. Doctor Who and the Cybermen is retitled from the TV serial because it's the first novelization to feature the Cybermen, even though it was not their first TV adventure. And so the original back cover blurb from 1975 spends some time introducing us to who the Cybermen are, promising us that this thread is almost as great as that of the mighty Daleks, before moving on to tease the story with a dramatic attack of capital letters. The satellite was the moon. The helpless planet, Earth. Their names, the Cybermen. The book price has also jumped up twice now in a year, from 25 pence to 35. It's the mid-1970s, man, and the economy is terrible everywhere. Gerry Davis is giving screenwriting credit for the original serial on the book's copyright page, even though the serial itself gave screen credit only to Kit Pedler. So no matter which copy of the book you own, looking at the front cover or back cover or copyright page is almost as rewarding as reading the text. This is the first Gerry Davis novelization, and the first Cybermen novelization. My thesis, beginning this week, is that Davis belongs right up there with Terrence Dicks and Malcolm Hulke as one of the best recurring Target contributors, excluding one-shot geniuses like Barry Letts, or much later on, Ben Aronovich. There's much to admire about Davis's writing style. For one thing, he was Doctor Who's story editor for the show's defining transition from the William Hartnell era to the Troughton era. He helped oversee the first regeneration, brought in Dr. Kit Pedler as scientific advisor while phasing out the historical adventures, and introduced the Cybermen as new recurring villains. He wrote without screen credit many of the scripts single-handed, and knew how to tell a good story economically, a critical skill, at a time when the show was being shoehorned back into its smaller-on-the-inside Studio D at Lime Grove. So with this book, you're reading the guy who redefined the show and made it much closer to the one that's still airing today. Another point, his prose style in the novelizations is both spare and evocative. He doesn't overuse adjectives, as we saw Brian Hales do in the previous novelization, Doctor Who and the Curse of Pelanon, as we discussed last week in episode 11. But Davis does paint a very effective word picture, invoking a broad range of senses and emotions. The regulars, the guest human characters, and the Cybermen pop off the page quite convincingly. This is also the first novelization to feature Ben and Polly. Coming out 8 years after its parent TV story, it may well have been greeted by an audience who had no idea who Ben and Polly were. But Davis captures them very well, both in his introductions and in getting into their heads via POV scenes. Please, Doctor, Polly did another of her instant switches. This time it was from, as Ben put it, the toffee-nosed Duchess giving orders, to the coy little girl lost act. All big eyes and wheedling, she took the Doctor's arm. Just a little look around, the moon. No more. And as for Ben, quote, his service instincts were aroused at the rudeness of the captain of the ship. He was a naval rating, able seaman, with 5 years' service, man and boy behind him, stepped forward, just resisting the temptation to salute. Also, Ben calls the Doctor Sir, and Davis admiringly talks about Polly's long legs and short skirt. He describes her outfit later on as a skimpy t-shirt and her usual miniskirt. He also redates Ben and Polly to the 1970s, as he would later do in his novelization of The 10th Planet, although on TV they were always stated to be from 1966, the year of their first televised adventure, The War Machines. This Ben, in fact, is even able to quote Neil Armstrong when first setting foot on the moon's surface. "First giant step and all that," he says, even though the original scripts predate July 20th, 1969. Davis makes good use of the companion's physical and mental attributes, with Ben using his trained sailor's vision to make out the details of a march of Cybermen 3 kilometers away. One bit of politically incorrect flirting, though, should not be attempted today. Davis writes, "Ben shrugged and turned away, rolling his eyes as if to say that he was the only sane one around. He dug Polly in the ribs. 'Carry on, nurse!' Polly turned quickly round, her hand upraised, but Ben had dodged out of reach, grinning." Davis also has a special sympathy for Jamie, the first companion introduced during his tenure. He writes, "An age before the invention of electric lights, trains, cars, airplanes, spaceships, or any of the modern marvels that Ben and Polly took for granted. Luckily, while Jamie had the courage of a lion, and all the Highland crofter's resourcefulness and cunning, he was a little thick, even by 1745 standards. Otherwise, this sudden leapfrogging of 2 1/3 centuries might have unhinged his reason. He accepted each new wonder philosophically, relating it to his primitive world when he could, accepting it without question when he couldn't, much as his father would have accepted the first sight of a stagecoach or a sailing ship as he journeyed from his mountain home." Later on, when Fraser Hines started playing the role of Jamie as much closer to himself, this description would no longer be accurate, but it works here, when Jamie hadn't quite yet become a fully formed character. Jamie is also still written heavily in dialect, as Terence Dix did in Jamie's first novelization, Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowmen. Jamie, for example, protests a rough ride in the TARDIS. "Aye, if it's always like this, you can leave me back at Culloden Field. I'd rather tack my chances with the Redcoats." And I apologize for my dreadful Scottish accent. I am just trying to read the lines as written. Jamie doesn't know where Mars is either. In a bit of dialogue thankfully omitted from the TV version, he asks, "What's Mars? I dinna ken where yon place is. Is it near to Glasgow, maybe?" Oh well, can't win 'em all. Davis does shine in his introduction to the Second Doctor. Throughout the book, Davis captures what it means to be Troughton-esque. We have almost a direct transfer of Troughton's careful, measured TV performance, which we'll get to in a little bit, into print. We're first introduced to him in the TV story's opening seconds, as the TARDIS is dragged off course by the moonbase's gravitron. Davis writes, "Throughout the crisis, the Doctor had seemed to withdraw into some remote world of his own, apparently unaffected by the plight of his young companions. He had found a way of wedging himself into the control position on the console, and had begun by making lightning-quick adjustments to the complex array of switches, levers, and buttons before him, intently studying the ever-changing lines of data on the readout screen before him. Still, in an intense concentration like a chess player, he gently flicked over a row of switches." The Doctor spends much of the early chapters of the book, as Davis describes him, in a silent and mysterious world of his own, frequently failing to answer his companions' questions, or consulting his 500-year diary, or flicking switches, or engaging in other bits of physical behavior, while masking the deep thought processes going on inside his head. Davis tells us that the Doctor senses danger before the crew even set foot outside the TARDIS. In several passages, Davis points out the detached and alien nature of this Doctor, reminding us that he, as usual, did not reveal his thoughts to the others. Worry is something he, quote, "normally never allowed to show on his face." He writes, "The Doctor, as usual, had been pursuing his own vein of thought, and didn't seem quite aware of Ben and Polly's conversation." Or, "As usual, he seemed quite unperturbed by the way events were shaping, almost without fear, in the conventional sense." But there's also a healthy bit of Troughton-esque clowning. Check out this description of the Doctor's outfit. Quote, "The Doctor was clad in a too long, down-at-heels black frock coat that had seen much better days, baggy striped trousers, and a large, very floppy, red cravat. Best of all, Davis rapidly cuts back and forth between Troughton as both the ancient man of mystery and the youthful prankster. The Doctor tries to remove a boot from a scientist who's still wearing it. Quote, the small boy inside the Doctor broke through for a moment, but also has, quote, surprising agility, and can be, quote, irritatingly mysterious when he's not the, quote, bumbling, absent-minded professor. His eyes glisten with the excitement of using the base's advanced 21st century technological equipment. There's a small boy inside the Doctor when he's defending the inconclusive results of his early investigations into the Cybermen's neurotropic virus to a skeptical Hobson. And as he delivers his famous line about some corners of the universe breeding the most terrible things, Davis has Polly note his facial expression as a far horizon's look. And when the Doctor's voice drops, suddenly low and urgent, quote, Polly felt a sudden prickling of fear at the base of her neck. The Doctor rarely spoke like this, and when he did, it was usually with good cause. This is on TV, the story where Troughton the actor dropped most of his affectations and props, a necessary means of getting him through his first 3 serials with the recorder, and the 500-year diary, and the funny hats, he would like a hat like that, and improbable disguises and wide-ranging accents. But by the Moonbase, Troughton's Doctor achieves a new evolutionary phase. Davis still writes those props into the book, where the Doctor often consults his diary, or, quote, drew the stethoscope out of his pocket and put it round his neck, the bumbling, absent-minded professor again, end quote. On TV, Troughton was, from this story forward, able to convey this newfound enigmatic side without props. But I'd argue that the book's characterization, which is based on an earlier draft of the TV serial, works just as well, by using the props as a key to the Doctor's thought processes. The Doctor, by the way, once again has capacious pockets, a term that both Malcolm Hulke and Terrance Dicks utilized in earlier novelizations. Maybe it was a missed opportunity to not title this podcast Capacious. The Moonbase is hard science, and check out Davis's big-budget opening pan of the Moon's surface. The TARDIS had landed on a long slope inside a huge crater. Behind them rose the high rim of the crater, like a series of small broken hills. Ahead of them, a long white plain stretched out to a black horizon. Had they landed on top of the crater rim, they would have seen an even more extraordinary sight. A fleet of Cybermen spaceships, long, sleek, and black, like marine torpedoes with small, swept-back wings. They lay in a protective circle, their cyber weapons mounted like sharp snouts in the bows of the craft. When I first read this book at age 11, I knew nothing about weather control, physics, or even the word toroidal, which is odd considering how many donuts I'd already consumed by then. Reading today, it's evident that Pedler and Davis designed the Moonbase carefully, to the extent that they devised a specific function for each crew member, and described the purpose of every console and telescope, and explained the biological clock and how it relates to living on the Moon. Less cool, however, is when the Doctor patronizingly, that's Davis's word, not mine, calls Polly clever for saying, I suppose so, when the Doctor asks her if she understands the science. I'm in no position to know if the science behind the gravitron is remotely plausible, but for a TV show that would later routinely replace hard science with wishful thinking, the Moonbase actually has the ring of authenticity, plus the quaint notion of scientists living together for the betterment of mankind. Davis even goes so far as to describe the Moonbase operator's diet, and acknowledges that people from the 1970s would not find the contents, duck concentrate, algae block, general hydroponic concentrate, and vegetable pellets very appealing. Before corporate real estate ventures wiped out many of Brooklyn's independent stores, algae block could have been the name of a trendy restaurant on Smith Street, or vegetable pellets would have been on Bedford Avenue in Williamsburg before the Whole Foods came to town. After the break, having established the TARDIS crew and the scientific setting, Gerry Davis is ready to debut 2 new alien races, Cybermen and Yorkshiremen.
The thing you saw, what was it like?
It was enormous and silver, and it had holes in its head for eyes, like a robot.
A robot?
But the Cybermen were all killed when Mondas blew up, weren't they?
Stop this Cyberman nonsense. There were Cybermen. Every child knows that, but they were all destroyed ages ago.
So we all thought.
That's enough. Now, let's have a little calm thinking. For the past 2 weeks, a completely unknown disease has appeared in the base. People drop in their tracks, they develop this black pattern on their skin. Then some of the patients disappear, right? Well, they can't leave the base without wearing spacesuits. There are no spacesuits missing, so where are they?
I must say, it does sound a little odd.
More than a little. But I do know one thing. A new disease starts, people disappear, and then you turn up.
And you think we did it?
Well, come off it. We haven't done a thing.
That's as maybe. I don't know who you are, what you are, or where you came from. But you can get off the moon now.
Yeah, well, that suits me fine. The sooner the better.
No, Ben, we can't go yet.
Well, why not? They don't want us here.
Because there is something evil here, and we must stay.
Evil? Don't be daft.
Evil is what I meant. There are some corners of the universe which have bred the most terrible things. Things which act against everything that we believe in. They must be fought. This disease, for instance, it isn't really a disease at all. But I can help you with it. You'll see. I'll find the cause for you.
Will you indeed?
Yes, certainly. Just need to examine a few things, that's all. Should be simple.
Well, I'm not sure. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you just one Earth day cycle to find the cause.
Earth what?
24 hours.
But that's no time at all.
It's all the time you're going to get.
Next, I want to talk about how Gerry Davis contrasts the cold and logical machinations of the Cybermen versus the hot-tempered and disorganized striving of the humans who run the moon base. The book begins with a prologue entitled The Creation of the Cybermen. If you're reading the books in publication order, this is the debut of this particular essay, which will become quite familiar over time. If you're reading the books in story order, you've already seen it before, in Doctor Who and the 10th Planet, but this is where it began. Centuries ago, by our Earth time, a race of men on the far distant planet of Telos sought immortality. They perfected the art of cybernetics, the reproduction of machine functions in human beings. As bodies became old and diseased, they were replaced, limb by limb, with plastic and steel. They became dehumanized monsters, and like human monsters down through all the ages of Earth, they became aware of the lack of love and feeling in their lives and substituted another goal: power. The second half of the prologue is unique to this book, telling us that by the year 2070, the Cybermen had become as known and feared in the galaxies as the Viking raiders of the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. We're given the story's exact date, too. The Cybermen first land on the moon, on what is my 97th birthday. I guess I know what I'll be reading on that date, the good Lord willing and the creek don't rise. The huge silver monsters that had once been men had achieved their first objective. As they would do on TV, the Cybermen spend the first half of the book as silent phantoms, seen only when abducting unconscious crew members or zapping poor Polly on the head. They arrive as an actual force with the Episode 3 material, and this is where Davis crams as many stage directions regarding the Cybermen, likely taken from the original scripts, as he possibly can. Even without the cover illustrations or video of the TV story, you can see and hear the Cybermen very well, thanks to how Davis writes them. Their voices, which are kind of hard to understand on TV in both this serial and their next one, are said to vibrate harshly, as though computerized. Their English is perfect, but flat, much more like a robot or a computer than a man, Davis writes. Hobson stares thunderstruck at the huge silver creature. On TV, Morris Barry cast tall actors to play the Cybermen and shorter actors to play the moon-based crew, a casting pattern that would recur throughout the Troughton years. The cyber weapons are particularly horrific on the printed page, much more so than on TV. In the book, the cyber weapons issue a loud metallic rattle, and a base crewman dies horribly. As the others watched in horror, smoke began to pour from the openings in his clothes. His eyes went blank. His body seemed almost to shrivel up. His face twisted and contorted, and he crashed toward the ground. The man looked as though he had received a colossal electric charge. His face was almost blackened, his close-cropped hair shriveled, as though badly burnt. Morris Barry, bless him, didn't coax quite such a convincing death on TV. In fact, the animators who did up the missing episode 3 for the DVD release, which is otherwise some lovely monochrome work steeped in shadows which flutter across the peripheral vision, didn't manage to make the death as convincing as the printed page. Davis, too, always seems to come up with the right visual word to convey his intended on-screen actions. The Cybermen don't just walk, they engage in a slow, ponderous march. When they weren't walking, they were as still as 2 suits of armor in a museum. The only thing that indicated life was a very slight whirring noise, which seemed to come from the chest unit every time they were about to speak, Davis writes. The Cybermen's inexorable march on the moon base, the episode 3 cliffhanger, is likened here by Ben to marching along like the guards on parade, and carrying a bazooka. For the kids in the audience, Ben helpfully explains what a bazooka is. Optimistically, Davis announces that there are 30 of the Cybermen in all. Also, amusingly, the Doctor looks for a historical parallel to this march of the Cybermen. He says, "This march towards the base is probably a show of strength, to scare us, the way the Zulus used to intimidate their enemies with their famous slow march." Hobson looked a little blank at the mention of Zulus. End quote. Davis differentiates his Cybermen too. One has a red line across his chest unit. The Cyber Leader, a role not defined on TV until Revenge of the Cybermen, which aired shortly after this book was released, has a black helmet, and even an individual name, Tarn, a vestige from the serial's first draft, coming soon after the 10th planet, in which the Cybermen were still individually named. The Cyber Leader here is taller than the others and had a noticeably deeper voice. Another Cyberman is called Krang, if you need it. Davis also restores to the Cybermen their relentless logic. On TV, during their long Episode 3 monologues, the Cybermen derided the Earthling brains as stupid, which is either bad directing or a conscious shout-out to Plan 9 from outer space. The Cybermen mocked the humans as clever, clever, clever. For the book, Davis substitutes the word stupid with rudimentary, and replaces the clever, clever, clever broadside with a more illuminating lecture on how the Cybermen would never have made a similar mistake. The Cybermen's defeat by gravity in the book is written in Davis's elegant prose. He writes, "Like dangling puppets, they accelerated rapidly into the black of space. Finally dwindling in gleaming spots of light, they diminished into the stars." While the Cybermen themselves are vividly written, Davis makes them stand out as even more alien by contrasting them against the emotional and inefficient moon-base crew. Hobson, the commander, is an impressive study in leadership. Almost every other base under siege story from seasons 4 and 5 featured mentally ill bosses gradually, and sometimes illogically, breaking down under the strain. But Hobson stands out by being utterly and ordinarily sane, and the book turns him into a Yorkshireman to highlight this even further. Polly finds Hobson gruff but reassuring. His accent seemed to get broader and more northern when irritated. The staff tolerates his occasional intemperate outbursts as a necessary letting off of steam for the older man. He treats a frightened Polly, in the aftermath of the episode 1 cliffhanger, with more gentleness than might have been expected from the irascible chief. Davis writes, "He directed operations with a word here and a word there. More gentle hints than shouted commands. The real leadership qualities of the man were now evident," thought the Doctor, watching him from the end of the room. The base was in good hands. Despite his occasional bluster and irascibility, Hobson was a man in 1,000. It was doubtful if he would crack now. In fact, one gets the sense that Davis has really mapped out every inch of this base and every quirk of his characters. The moon-based scientists, apart from Hobson, were pretty interchangeable on TV, most of them being credited en masse rather than by individual character name. But here we learn that Sam, for example, is the nuts and bolts man, the only man on the crew who understood the workings of every piece of machinery on the moon's surface. On TV, Sam was characterized only by his last name, Beckett, meaning that this is a future Quantum Leap episode. Okay, thanks. Bye. There's also a cute little moment where Hobson, age 45 in the book, younger than Patrick Barr who played him on TV, makes a joke about the loud music of the Gravitron room, presumably compared to the rock and roll music. Perhaps you have to be under 40 to stand it, he says. The slow-motion, low-gravity moon surface chase of Benoit by a Cyberman looks, let's be honest, pretty dated on TV, but it's livened up in the book by Nils, keeping up a running commentary. This would have required a voiceover over the filmed insert, which wouldn't have been technically possible in early 1967. Davis also adds physical drama. We read about Benoit's long, loping strides, his pounding heart, his bursting lungs, the harsh grating sound of his breath as related over the moon intercom. Charmingly, Davis was proud of the very narrow diversity of the moon base crew. He writes from the early 1970s, without a hint of irony, a great variety of nationalities was represented: British, French, Italian, German, and Dutch. Ralph on TV was meant to be Nigerian, per the DVD text commentary, his nationality not given in the book. Davis's biggest effort at diversity, other than that, is a minor American character, Chuck, who speaks in a slow drawl, of course. There had been no Americans in the TV serial, because, what would Americans know from the moon? And as for the sets, the DVD text commentary stresses that Davis had very specific set layouts in mind, and structured the action to optimize use of those sets. What he didn't count on was the production being demoted to Little Lime Grove D, but restoring the large and spacious sets of his imagination for the novelization, he tells us that, quote, the Cyberman spaceship nearest to the base somewhat resembled the interior of a submarine. No concessions were made for comfort, rest, or food, as in a human spaceship. Every spare inch was covered with highly sophisticated apparatus. In the book, the moon base also has an observation dome and a catwalk, and the business about covering a puncture in the exterior dome with a tea tray is given more gravitas, with characters having to climb a ladder, with Hobson being too physically old, at age 45, ZOMG, and winded to make the climb, and Ben having to save the day. If you came into this story through the novelization first, as I suspect most of us did, the TV production now stands as something of a letdown. But I'll give the TV serial the last word, in the interest of fairness. One clever thing Morris Barry did on TV is when the Doctor quietly speculates to himself about what objects present in the moon base could help defeat the Cybermen. Davis narrates the Doctor's thought processes, which is fine. But on TV, as captured in the Episode 3 animation, Director Barry actually has the Doctor argue with himself, half speaking and half voiceover thoughts. That's a pretty nifty bit of direction, if nothing else. Also missing is a Michael Craze ad-lib on TV. Polly points to a blip on a monitor screen and asks if that's a spaceship. In the book, nobody responds, but Craze on TV quipped, "No, that's a scanner." This was my first Doctor Who novelization, and I still love it to pieces. Tell you what, let's reconvene here on my 97th birthday, and we'll talk about it then one last time. Coming up next, my guest interview for the week with Mr. Pete Lambert.
Who's got the power to read? Who looks into books for the answers we need?
And I'm back now, and I'm joined by my guest for the week, Pete Lambert. Pete, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you. I'm really excited.
You and I have both worked together on Trap 1. I think you and I worked together last on the Horror of Fang Rock episode.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that was great.
And you are now, I believe, also one of the permanent recurring co-hosts on Trap 1 as well. Is that right?
Yeah. It's great to be on there, and I think there's maybe a thematic similarity between Horror of Fang Rock and the Moonbase stroke Cybermen, in at least one respect, if we're talking genres of Who.
Well, there's the base under siege format. You also have to take into account horror is one of my favorite TV stories, and Doctor Who and the Cybermen, which is the novelization of the Moonbase, is one of my favorite books. So they're both pretty high up all time on my list.
Likewise. You're not going to get a Minority Report on that from me for this one. It's absolutely one of my favorite books and stories of all time. Yeah.
So, in other words, this is not going to be a very contentious episode, and if you want to hear fighting and bickering, I guess this is not going to be the episode for you.
Well, we can try and put something in, can't we? We could argue about who's our favourite member of the base crew or something.
Well, that's not even an argument. Obviously, the answer is Benoit.
Ah, damn, yeah, I agree about that as well. Oh no, complete
All
agree.
right. I'll just put on some tea and we'll sit back and sip some tea and talk about how much we love the book, and nothing unpleasant is going to happen over the next hour.
Unless there happen to be Cybermen hiding in the wainscoting that we don't know about. 8-foot robots have a terrible tendency of sneaking out of little cupboards and things.
That's true. I've got a cat staring at me suspiciously, but she's 8 pounds rather than 8 feet tall.
Okay, but and is she as stealthy as a Cyberman or he?
Oh, no, no, no. Smudge makes herself known. She will, if I am in the shower, she will throw herself repeatedly at the bathroom door trying to break it down just to get at me.
Oh, our cat is the opposite. She's very somewhat reclusive, but occasionally gives you a little bit of attention, and you know it's special. But that's quite unusual cat behavior, isn't it?
To quote Julian Glover in City of Death, where Smudge is concerned, you could hardly call it stealth.
Yeah.
So, Pete, how long have you been a Doctor Who fan?
Yeah. When did I officially consider myself it? We're talking about 1981. It's the leaving of Tom Baker generated a lot of interest. I was 6 at the time, and I'd caught a few of his episodes, but hadn't become a fan because I tended to watch the other side on Saturday nights. We had Wurzel Gummidge and Buck Rogers every Saturday at night on ITV, which when I was 6, that just offered everything I wanted. I couldn't understand why I'd watch another program, but a new kid at school kept telling me I had to watch Doctor Who, and they did summer repeats after that series. Of course, the famous Five Faces series, which I think a lot of fans, British fans my age, is what really got them into it because you had this amazing revolving door of genres that just went from one to another, from Unearthly Child to the Crotons to the Carnival of Monsters. And it was Carnival of Monsters that made me realize I could spend my money on a Doctor Who book because I saw in the W.H. Smith's children's section in town they had Carnival of Monsters quite prominently displayed the week that it had been on TV. So I picked that up as my first target, and then I think the Cybermen was probably my second, just a little while after.
That's a really funny coincidence because the Cyberman was literally the first book that I bought. My first set of 3 purchased what in the States is a national holiday, Super Bowl Sunday, 1985. So
Yeah.
I got this copy, the 1980s reprint with the neon tube, historically inaccurate logo,
Yes, it's great.
and the non-Chris Achilleos, but still pretty nifty cover art of the almost gold-tinted Cybermen floating in space with the Earth behind them. Which is your copy of
Yep.
Cybermen?
Holding up now. So mine is the Tom. This is the 1980 reprint. I think it's the 4th edition of the version with the original cover with the invasion style Cybermen and the sort of reddy brown Tom Baker style logo. But this was also one of the first Doctor Who books that I discovered was available in different formats, and this amazed me that there was a second-hand bookshop in Leicester, where I'm from, where I could go and buy a different version of the same book. And this was probably a couple of years later, and it just never occurred to me that why would you do that? Why would you want more than one copy of the same book just because it's got a different logo on it? And I just had them both, and I thought, wow, this feels good. I want to do this more. And I think that was the point that I changed from a reader primarily into a collector primarily, because I liked having the full set. That just gave me a bit of a buzz.
That is all thanks to Doctor Who and the Cybermen, then.
It is, yeah. That was the one that hooked me into multi-format versions of it.
So the other copy that you held up, your second copy, that appears to be the original because you have the block logo, which was retired shortly after this book, and you have the original Chris Achilleos cover art.
That's right, yeah. First edition 74. So yeah. So I'm holding it more clearly for you.
Wow. And
Yeah.
I've got the second to last Target edition. I assume there was a blue spine in this book that came out in the early 90s, but this is the 5th printing, the 1984 reprint, and I got this in January 85. This would have been brand new at the time that I picked it up.
Does it have the same blurb on the back with the very the bit in capitals towards the end where it all gets very Flash Gordon, and the satellite was the moon, the helpless planet Earth.
No, I've already read out the cover blurb earlier in the podcast for the portion that you weren't
Of
present for.
course. Yeah.
But it says a mystery virus is wreaking havoc among the crew of the Earth's weather control station on the moon. And then towards the bottom, there's the awful pun, who is responsible?
Oh dear. No, we didn't get that on the old version. Yeah, and this was bought for I'm just noticing it's still got the price written in pencil from the second time I bought it, and it cost me 75 pence. That would have been in the early 80s.
This was $2.95 for the U.S. edition, and that was 1 week of babysitting my kid sister after school. For 3 hours a week, I got one book a week.
We learn the value of time and capitalism through these things, don't we?
That would make me more of a laborer than a capitalist, but instead of
True.
the 75 pence, I wrote in, after I got the program guide, the serial's production code on the inside cover.
So yeah, I can see the HH is there for all to be seen. That's great. Mine has got my mum has written my name in it, so I must have taken it to school for reading, and she must have done that to make sure I didn't lose it at school or get it mixed up with someone else's. And I've written PN11 in the front of it because I think it was my 11th paperback book. Yeah, that would be it. I had my own numbering system before Target went back and did them all alphabetically.
See, I've got book number 14, which is nifty because when I did Curse of Peladon in last week's show, my copy of Peladon is numbered 13, so I'm doing consecutive target numbers in consecutive broadcasts purely by coincidence.
That's just from the alphabet. Yeah, the alphabet happened to coincide with the publication order for just those two.
Exactly, because the two stories happen to be in alphabetical order. Curse followed by Cybermen.
That caused so much confusion when they started doing that. That was such a stressful period because do I need to reorganize all my old books?
It definitely confused me as a kid because I wasn't sure whether to shelve my books in number order or in alphabetical order, or after I got the program guide in story order. So I went back and forth over the years with some mix of all three, but for the last, decades, all I've been doing is keeping them in strict story order.
It's what feels right, doesn't it? I think I even had one crazy phase where I decided to file them in order by alphabetically by the author's name, as a library would, and it was disgusting and wrong, and I had to put them back again as soon as I did it, because that was just we don't do that. That's not how Doctor Who works.
Especially because you have such an inequity. You would have 2 Brian Hales books, 65 Terrence Dicks books,
Yeah.
1 book by Glyn Jones, and then
Yeah,
so
the A
on
to
and so
D
forth.
section was very well stocked. Yeah, or just the D's actually, basically.
See, it's funny that you wrote your name in yours. I can assure you that growing up in the States, I was the only child bringing Doctor Who novelizations to school. There was no chance of this book being mistaken for John's or Stephen's or David's or Josh's, or we had 3 Alyssas in our class, and it certainly didn't belong to any of them.
Yeah, there was a little clique of us. There was 3 kids in my class when I was that age who were the Doctor Who fan group, who were the only ones who talked about, but we did talk about it to each other and argued about it and had debates about who was the best Doctor. I decided quite quickly that Troughton was my favourite Doctor. I think based on having really enjoyed the Crotons, and then a few weeks later there was the repeat of the 3 Doctors, and it was like a past Doctor coming back. In my case, a past Doctor from 2 weeks ago, because they were tripping them over the week, but it still felt he must be the most important and best one because they brought him back again. They didn't do that for any of the others. So to my young self, that just proved he was the best. And I really like how brooding and scary he looks on the front cover of this book. Yeah.
Which sort of belies the reality of Patrick Troughton at the Doctor, because his Doctor was much more, as Terrence Dicks said in The Abominable Snowman, gentle and comical.
Yeah. Did like killing monsters though. He's a real monster slayer, isn't he?
Yes, and he.
That famous. I'm sure you may have already covered it or have it down to the cover, but the first thing that really stood out to me listening to this through again is that his famous quote about there are evil things that must be fought, and in the book it's evil thing that must be fought to the death.
To the death.
But then there's a line about him having a little twinkle in his eye after it or something. So it's ameliorated. But yeah, this guy is here to kill monsters.
I think this is where Polly refers to him as having a quote-unquote far horizons look in his eye when he gets in one of those moods.
Yeah, it's
See,
nice.
interesting for me, because I would have gotten this book in 85. I would have been watching Doctor Who on television for a little over 2 months at that point. We were just about to finish the Peter Davison run, but The Five Doctors was one of my first stories, so I had seen Simulacrum of the First Doctor, and I had seen the second and third, and I had seen the 2 clips from Shada for the fourth. So I didn't know the second Doctor very well, and I would not have heard of Ben or Polly at all. I probably would have remembered Jamie from the Five Doctors, but I don't recall if I connected that with his appearance in this book. And if I had seen Ben and Polly's faces in the companion montage, courtesy of Ian Levine in the Resurrection of the Daleks, I didn't know thing one about them starting this book. And to be reading a book in 1985 with a 1974 copyright date would have seemed like I was reading a book from a lost age and another century. Whereas the kicker is this book was newer then than the Harry Potter books are now.
Oh boy, that's got me. Yeah. Sometimes those comparative date things don't really hit, but that one does. Yeah, because it did just seem it was an ancient tome of a distant, unimaginable monochrome past, wasn't it? So yeah, so you already knew this. So yeah, so for me, this was I'd seen the Crotons and the Three Doctors. So yeah, I guess I did know the second Doctor quite well before seeing this. But yeah, Polly and Ben, exactly as for you, were completely new to me, and they're kind of written, aren't they, in this with that in mind? I guess Gerry Davis knew well that he was. Oh, silly, but I said that I had 2 friends who used to talk about Doctor Who thing with that involved arguing a lot about the correct way about what counted and what didn't. Nothing changes. And one of my friends insisted that it was pronounced Gerry Davis because it was spelt with a G. And it rang. I know you've just pulled the exact same face that I would pull when he said this, and he's out there on Facebook. I should look him up actually now and say, "See, I've proved you. I know you were wrong all those years ago." He's because it was if he thought it would be a J if it was anyway. These things we should leave behind as we grow older, but for some reason that stuck with me. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of in these early books. I guess, and as, I know as you said in the previous episodes, which I've enjoyed listening to of your podcast, the way that they wrestle with this idea of is this a continuous series? Do we need to, like Joe Grant gets an introduction, and then we get to her real introduction, and obviously they're still doing it when they get to novelizing Unearthly Child. It's another. Right back with the very first book, we had a separate introduction for Ian and Barbara. This yeah, I hadn't thought about that until you started talking about it on these shows about the choices that must be being made to do a past Doctor novel, and to what the fact that they did largely stick with what was televised, but just put a bit more background maybe and a little bit more info to it. But there's no how the Doctor met any of these people other than it just getting mentioned in the course of the narrative, isn't it? Jamie, I suppose. Although you could imagine that this was Jamie's first. You could imagine that the Highlanders had just happened, couldn't you? There's no mention of Atlantis.
I am sure that Gerry Davis was quite happy to pretend that Underwater Menace had never happened.
Yeah, that wasn't on at the top of the list.
So I'll give John Blum credit. That was John's observation that the first 6 proper Target books were all a series written to a purpose. And it wasn't until The Abominable Snowman that they went back in time and went out of order. So that's an interesting point that John brings up, because after Abominable Snowman, you get Curse of Peladon, right? But that is not the first Ice Warriors story. Then you get the novelization of the Moonbase, which is the first Cybermen novelization, but is not the first Cybermen story. So reading this, naturally, you probably wouldn't have known the first thing about 10th Planet. What was your frame of reference for the Cybermen when you first read this? Because mine would have been limited to their brief appearance in the Five Doctors. I wouldn't have seen anything else at that point. And did you think this was the first Cyberman story, or did you have an interest in going back and finding out the previous adventure that is referred to in this one, which we now know is the 10th planet.
Yeah, because they do, and I was surprised on rereading this. I'd forgotten that they do name check. I thought they completely in my memory. I'd forgotten that they didn't completely draw a veil over it, and the Cybermen in this do refer to oh yeah, our other home planet, Mondas, but we're from Telos, which obviously is Gerry Davis tidying up after the fact when he had his chance to novelize. But yeah, I don't think when I read this, so I think I had already seen in Doctor Who magazine some degree of episode guides, so or that poster that there was a poster with Tom Baker on it that had the stories listed. So I did know that this was the second Cyberman story, but I didn't know anything more than that. So I didn't have any particular expectations about it, and I was so fresh to Doctor Who in general that but I knew there was something about it. This Doctor and these monsters were because that's the other thing. The Cybermen were my favourite monsters all along, and I would definitely read this before Earthshock, so I was already a full-on Cyberman fan when that came along. So that was utterly mind-blowing and fantastic for me. And I think I then tracked down Tomb and 10th Planet after this one and got the order sort of sorted in my head. But it is confusing. You just you do just roll with it at that age to a certain extent, like the fact that the Cybermen on the front cover of this is completely different to the ones shown in the illustrations within it. And yet
Right.
because you only see those illustrations when you happen to pass those 4 pages of the book, in my mind's eye, it's the one on the cover that I look at every time I pick it up. So that is actually the Cybermen that I'm seeing in my mind's eye when I watch this. Sorry, when I remember the book, and the TV episodes end up contradicting that. It kind of like the book is my primary source for this story. So that painting is just so embedded in me that the ones on TV feel like the cover version, if you'll excuse the pun, of the one on the cover of the book that's the definitive, even though I know it's wrong. That's You get used to playing these sort of circular logic games, don't you, to try and join things up that just don't really join up.
To quote Perry in The Two Doctors, circular logic will only make you dizzy.
Indeed.
That brings up an interesting point about Gerry Davis, though, because he takes a few more liberties by adapting the story to what was the present day. So if Moonbase comes out in early 67, and this book is released almost 8 years later, you'll notice that he takes Ben and Polly and he changes their point of origin from 1966 to the 1970s. And I think this is the book where Ben says, we didn't have a setup like this in the 70s.
Yeah.
Whereas in 10th Planet, which is coming up in a couple more months on this podcast, he has Ben watching a James Bond movie that hadn't been released at the time 10th Planet came out, but was current when the novelization came out.
That's a neat game for him to play, isn't it? Yeah, and we get Ben misquoting Neil Armstrong in this book as well, which is great because that hadn't happened yet when it was broadcast. I like that. I like that kind of little thing, and it's not done in a showy way. It doesn't detract. Yeah, it's a nice touch. So I've listened. I reread the book when we first discussed becoming on this, and I was very excited. And I've re-listened to Annika Wills reading the audiobook. I say listened. It wasn't re-listening. I hadn't listened to her doing it before, and that really cemented with me. And I don't know if you have this feeling or if this is purely a mood thing on my part, but to me, Polly feels like the narrator of this book, even though it's third person. It just feels like Polly's story. She's the one who recognizes the Cyberman and tells everyone else it's a Cyberman. She's the one who invents the Polly cocktail for taking them out. Ben is definitely her assistant. He even calls her professor at one point, which I love. That would feel like a lovely nod to the Seventh Doctor and Ace if it had been written a few decades later.
Right.
But it's a nice coincidence. And yeah, or maybe this is just me having a natural affinity for glamorous women, which there's a hint of the absolutely fabulous in Polly. She's the one who could quite happily sit down with Joanna Lumley and co. I think from that set. So yeah, I gravitate, if you'll excuse the pun, towards her. But is that a feeling is that a general feeling about this book, or do you think that's just my preference?
Annika Wills is the first Doctor Who actor that I got to meet and spend an amount of time with. I think in the spring of '97, I was living in Ohio, which is the Midwestern United States, and it's very close to Ontario. And I had a friend at the time who was involved in running a small Toronto-based Doctor Who convention. So I drove up to Toronto, crossing the border, and I spent one day at this. It was a one-day convention, and the two guests were Annika, who was living in Vancouver at the time, so all she had to do was fly across Canada. It wasn't like going all the way across the pond. And the actor who was then calling himself John Anthony Blake as his professional name. So I had breakfast with the con showrunner and the two of them, and then I sat at the, um, what's the word for it? The dealer's room and the autograph room were in one place. So I was sitting at the autograph table selling the glossy photos of Annika and of John Anthony Blake. So I got to meet both of them, and I was just smitten with Annika, even though I was, quite probably 30 years younger. But just spending time with her, she was a force of nature. And I guarantee she has no recollection of me at all. This is, one day out of her life. But she made a large impression on me. So from that moment on, Annika became one of my favorite companion actresses. I've never seen her again. But I got the same impression as you, even reading this book for the first time. And I read it all in a single day in 1985, which is probably 37 years ago today. Probably just about. Because that would have been late January, which is where we are as I record this on the Wednesday. I also got the impression that she was the primary companion in the book, because I think Gerry Davis puts more scenes from her point of view. Like, she's the one who narrates the scene where the Doctor starts talking about pursuing the Cybermen to the death. Whereas, of course, poor Jamie is kept off camera most of the time, so we rarely see him in the book at all. And when we do, he is speaking in this impenetrable dialect, which, as an 11-year-old kid with a thick New York accent, I would have had no idea what I was reading.
I thought he kept saying "och," and I didn't know what it meant. I had to ask. I think I asked my dad or somebody explained to me. In Scotland they say "och," and I was like, "Why?" They just do. That was a a baby step into at least getting some characters that don't just speak in received pronunciation all the way through it.
And Wikipedia advises me that Super Bowl 19, which was the day that I had this book bought for me, was January 20th, 1985. So I just missed the anniversary of my reading this by about a week, 6 days.
Happy anniversary! Happy almost anniversary.
So how old were you when you read this for the first time?
So it was if it was 81, then I was 8. Yeah, and just really get at that point. It was later that I got into buying multiple copies and things. 3 or 4 years later, maybe. At that point, I just wanted as many Doctor Who adventures as I could get. But and if you went into somewhere like W.H. Smith's big general purpose store in any British city, they'd always have a good stock of targets. In fact, I bought my first target, Carnival of Monsters, a few weeks before this. At the same time as I bought what turned out to be my last Enid Blyton book. So that was a sort of handover. I think it was the last of the Faraway Tree saga, which it is about a group of friends who who find a mysterious tree. They climb up it and they have a different adventure every week on a different world that happens to be passing the top of the tree on top of a cloud, with much drama about whether or not they can get back to the tree in time without being captured by baddies and demons and things. It's not a huge leap to a group of people in a police box flying around the universe and having similar adventures in multiple genres.
For me, I had gone through 3 book series that I read obsessively before I got to Doctor Who. So starting when I was 6, I started reading all the compilation of Peanuts cartoons. So for a good year or 2 years, all I was doing was carrying around these enormous, either library hardcover or store-bought paperback selections of Peanuts strips from the 50s through the 70s. So that was all I read for a good year or 2. Then I was gifted the Hardy Boys, and I don't know if the Hardy Boys are big over there in the UK.
I've heard of it, but I don't know it. Yeah.
So there was a guy named Edward Stratemeyer in New Jersey in the New York City suburbs, and he became a syndicate writer. He would come up with the characters, and he would pay a collection of young jobbing writers to write the books to his plot outline. So there ended up being probably about 60 Hardy Boys books published over a span of 30 or 40 years. And they were all attributed to the same writer who doesn't exist, Franklin W. Dixon, which is a great name, but there's
It
no such
is.
person.
All right.
And then he also did the Nancy Drew series, which was the Hardy Boys for girls, but instead of two brothers, one 16 and one 15, it was one plucky girl. And both of those series have generated TV series that are still running here in the States.
Mhm.
So those are very well known to generations of American kids, but it's very American based. It's, teenage detectives who are solving mysteries on their own. And then, there's criminal syndicates, and especially in the early Hardy Boys books, you have tons of racism because that was, the 1920s. But um, it's still a safe universe, even though there's guns and kidnappings. Nobody ever dies, not even the bad guys.
Right.
So probably from ages 7 through 10, all I was doing was reading the Hardy Boys. And the fact that I was in a New York City suburb and they were in a New York City suburb was also pretty huge for me. And my kid's name is actually taken from one of the Hardy Boys characters, but unfortunately she has shown no interest in reading about her fictitious namesake. So then I discovered the Choose Your Own Adventure books, because those were very big in the early 80s. So at
Yeah.
the exact moment that you were discovering Carnival of Monsters, I was discovering the Choose Your Own Adventure. So then for 2 years, that's all I was reading, one Choose Your Own Adventure book after
Oh,
another. So for me, the symbolic handoff was getting these books at age, I would have been, just past 11 years old.
yeah.
And for the next 4 or 5 years, outside of school assignments, all I was reading was Doctor Who novelizations.
I was very similar. I mixed it up a little. I liked the Narnia books, which are very over here. Them I think they're maybe more embedded in children's everyday reading. They were as big as Harry Potter was. In 70s, 80s, Narnia books were still as big as Harry Potter is now or was 10 years ago. And I think I read I liked general science. I read the Tripods books as well when that came out, but that was a few years later actually, because that was when that was on TV. Yeah, so that would be a little bit later.
Yeah, I
But,
read those at around the same time because what was the first book? The White Mountains?
White Mountains, yeah.
That was very big among my circle of friends. So the same guy who got me into Doctor Who got me into the Tripods, but I don't remember if I read all three books. Because when I read the third book back about 7 or 8 years ago, I had no recollection of any of it. But I know I read most of the Tripods as a kid. And Narnia was very big in the States for a time because there was the animated version of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that came out in about 79, which is now available on YouTube.
Oh yeah.
I remember us discussing that at school, and I took The Last Battle out of the library, which was the last book in the series. Now, growing up in a Jewish family, having no frame of reference for Christianity or knowing what Aslan was supposed to represent, when I read The Last Battle, I understood the book, but I didn't understand what it was representing. So when I went back and reread The Last Battle 10 years ago, I'm like, how did this book not destroy me for life? How was I reading about a universe where the characters would rather be dead and in heaven than alive and on Earth?
Yeah, I had a very unreligious upbringing, but my dad had a very Christian fundamentalist mum who was thrilled that I was reading these books, and I couldn't figure out why, because I was like, "What is this magic lion and stuff?" That Nana seems to like them for some reason, where she thinks my other books are silly. And it was only later that I joined the dots, because yeah, it wasn't just wasn't part of my upbringing to be familiar with all the mythology that was being riffed on there.
I was purchased by my dad a slipcase copy of all 7 of the Chronicles of Narnia books.
Ooh, nice.
Now, they're still being sold in the States, but some genius, and I use that word advisedly, has reordered the books. Because when I got them, they were released in publication order. So Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe came
Mm.
first, Prince Caspian came second. When they sell the books now, they sell them in chronological order to Narnia. So Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe comes midway through the series, which to me makes no
Mm.
sense.
Yeah, because the others are written to answer questions about the past that Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe floats. I think, yeah. So answering those questions before you've got to the point in time that asks them seems wrong.
Right, like with the Star Wars. For those of us of a certain age, the only true order is 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. Because if you watch it
Yeah,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as Lucas intends, you lose the whole big twist in Episode 5 about the parentage of Luke's father.
yes, yes.
Spoilers for younger viewers: Luke's father is actually Obi-Wan Kenobi.
It's a shock. It's a real shock. But yeah, it just becomes a film about this guy who's the last person in the universe to find out who his dad is. Whereas when you're watching it with him and finding out with him, it's quite a different feeling that you're finding out at the same time as him.
Growing up on the same planet, growing up on the same farm with your crazy uncle,
Yeah.
who is
And that,
literally your uncle, but you don't know it. Yeah. So we've talked a lot about children's book series and how those were kind of gateways to Doctor Who for us. And we've talked about the book series that we left behind after Doctor Who took over our lives. You raised a really good point on Twitter earlier in the week when you were promoting this episode. And thank you for that, by the way.
that's right.
You
It's
were
fun.
talking about Gerry Davis's word choice and how this is the only Doctor Who book that uses probably two specific words. What were the two
Yes.
words that you had in mind?
The two words were radiophonic and fetish. Not in the same sentence, but I think in the same chapter. Yeah, radiophonic is a lovely one to sneak in for the fans. I get it, isn't it? That's an adult a joke for the grown up fans who know that there was a radiophonic workshop describing the sound that the gravitron is making. Um, Fetish brings us back to who I think we've already both just identified earlier as being really the main player of this whole thing. And Benoit has what's the exact sentence? He all
I
made
think it made a fetish out of exercise.
Yeah, or his superb physique or
Oh,
something like
right,
that.
right,
Yeah,
right. That
his
was it.
superb physical appearance. That's it. I'm scrolling through my notes. I knew I'd written it down. He almost made a fetish of his superb physical appearance.
Which is
And
not necessarily evident from the actor who plays him on television.
no, now and that guy, Andre Maran, is he's like we often joke. There's lots of jokes about becoming a Doctor Who fan. You notice there are only 10 British actors who are in every 70s and 80s thing. Moran is the one French actor who worked in Britain. I think he actually emigrated. He became British, but he got more and more French throughout his career, and he's just in everything from Yes Minister, Pink Panther. And he was even in when I was being taught French at school. We were shown an old film starring him, an old series that I think was a BBC and French co-production, where he played Luciani, a mysterious villain was in a who was Dons Le Chateau, and we had to write. Luciani est Dons Le Chateau was what I inexplicably shouted when I was first shown the moon base on a very wobbly, a millionth generation tape on discovering that he was in it, because he's just whenever British TV needs a French face, they get him. Just to really emphasize the Frenchness, we've got that little cravat in the TV show, which is probably non-uniform, but that just shows, short of him having a baguette tucked under his arm at all times as well. So they've got a. So I guess Gerry Davis is thinking, well, I've not actually got the most French actor in the universe in my book. I'm going to really ramp this up, and he's stylish and he was described as extremely fresh or something like that at one point as well. It's like,
It's funny about you recognizing Andre Moran because obviously most of the actors in Doctor Who you're only going to know about in the States if you have a severe Anglophile fetish, to use that word again.
why not?
But when you come back to the 10th planet, which I realize is the Cyberman story before this one, the guy who plays the American sergeant in episode 1 of 10th Planet and who was then killed off at the cliffhanger, that actor, I think, was in every American movie and every American television series between 1955 and the year 2000. He is in Scarface. He was on Beverly Hills 90210 for crying out loud. He made a career of playing cops. So even though he spent a little bit of time in the UK and had this 1 week engagement on Doctor Who that he probably never put on his resume later in life,
Yeah.
that guy's everywhere in American media. So I guess he would be the Andre Moran of the United States with the crazy New York accent to boot.
Yeah, sometimes people have just nailed something so specifically that a casting director is just going to grab them the second they can. And why go for an Andre Moran type when you can get Andre Moran? And it must have been reasonably priced or something. And yeah,
thus making the American guy the only actor to be in Scarface and Beverly Hills 90210 and Doctor Who. That is quite a unique
very
combination
spectacular.
of
Yeah,
casting credits.
that is
I think
spectacular.
I think Radiophonic is probably the first in joke that I got because I would have been watching the credits obsessively, and the Davison era would have said title music by Ron Grainer and the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. So I would have
Yeah.
connected that word when I first read it in the book in 1985 to Doctor Who.
I think I was probably too innocent to think that. I probably just thought it was just one of those words that people used a lot. I wonder if I dropped it. I probably dropped it at school at some point, aged 8. But yes, the piano playing was very radiophonic today. I could imagine me trying to do that and landing flat on my face.
So let me ask you a question then,
Hmm,
and I have a specific reason for asking this.
fire
Is the
away.
prose style in this book too advanced for children of the age that we were when we first started reading it?
I don't think so. No. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think so because it's these little things. It's just peppered with little things like that stand out to us now. But on the whole, uh, it's adventure prose. It's exciting adventure prose. I felt it took me along. There were a couple of bits that I jotted down that stood out of me as quite funny now. Like he describes the Cybermen as directing the people, the controlled humans, the way a shepherd directs sheepdogs in the Welsh mountains. And that was the strangest piece of prose for describing what a Cyberman is doing to a zombified human. But and it creates an image of them what they're whistling. Are they? But so that was maybe I don't know, with hand gestures. I don't know, but yeah, no, I was or certainly anyway. I did so. I was not in any way an advanced reader. I liked reading, but I wasn't. I wasn't top of the class. But it didn't. It carried me with it. I noticed there's a couple of more on more than one occasion. It explains what the word torus means. Donut, the torus meaning donut-shaped gravitron, and that crops up at least twice. But then I can remember much later in life not remembering what torus meant and having to be told it again. I say much later, I mean teenager or something. It cropped up, and I distinctly remember being embarrassed that I didn't know what it had meant. So I wish I had remembered because it was in here all the time.
I'm still laughing at the Welsh sheepdog thing because I would have had zero. That would have gone over me so
Oh
far
god.
over my head. I mean, how was I, as an American kid in New York City, supposed to know what a Welsh sheepdog and shepherd was like? What
Yeah, very
the heck?
specifically Welsh, not any not any other types. But in the UK, the Sheepdog Trials was on TV. It was Sunday afternoon TV, when the BBC had no other sport to show, and it got One Man and His Dog got quite a high ratings. I think it was a BBC Two thing, but people found it pastoral and calming to watch men standing in the rain whistling at dogs for an hour or two competitively on a Sunday.
So here's an embarrassing confession about lost cultural references. There's a scene late in the book where Benoit is on the surface of the moon being chased by Cybermen, and he has to get back to the airlock before the Cyberman can break his neck.
Yeah.
And I think it's Nils is up top in the observation dome calling out a running commentary of the chase.
Yeah.
And I think Davis uses the line, Nils's commentary, or whoever it was, had been more exciting than a cup final. Now, you and I both know now, and you would have known your whole life, this refers to the World Cup of football, which in the U.S. is called soccer. I had never heard of the World Cup as an 11-year-old in early 1985. I would not have had any idea. We had a couple of professional, short-lived soccer leagues, and there were two New York City-based football clubs, the Arrows and the Cosmos, one of which had Pele, the great South American football player. But I wouldn't have known about the World Cup. However, as a Long Island kid, I was a huge fan of hockey, which had the Stanley Cup every year, and the Islanders had just finished winning 4 straight hockey Stanley Cups out of Long Island, New York. So when Gerry Davis writes about Cup Final, I probably assumed that he was referring to hockey. It was years before I realized what he was actually talking about.
Yeah, and it could be used more generically here for any kind of sporting the final of any sporting competition where you win something. But specifically, it would football would be the first place you would go. Yeah, in your mind's eye, definitely.
And of course, I read this on Super Bowl Sunday, which is the biggest day of the year for
Yeah.
American football.
Mm.
And
And
here's Davis talking about the other kind. So coming back to my question about the prose style, my daughter now is the same age that I was when I started reading these books, just past 11 years old. So I have spent the last 11 years following her reading progress, going from board books, and then when she gets to grade school, they have the letter-based Fountas and Pinnell reading system, where every book is categorized on a letter from A through Z, and you're given a reading level in class, and you're encouraged to only read books out of that reading level. So, reading level A through D is for kindergarten, and then by the time you get to middle school, you should be up to Z books. So, like Hunger Games are considered Y or Z. The Divergent series by Veronica Roth is considered Z. The Matt Christopher sports books are considered M's, which my kid left behind years ago.
Mhm.
But everything is so homogenized, right? So you have this scientific-based reading method, and kids are supposed to advance along, and they're not encouraged to stray too far from their reading level. And that dictates a certain number of chapters and a certain style of vocabulary and a certain content. I don't know, and maybe you've got a different view coming at this from the UK side of things, but I don't know if this book would ever fit into the current US-based reading system, because the vocabulary, especially for someone like Gerry Davis or Philip Hinchcliffe or later on Peter Grimwade, who emptied out their thesaurus to write these books and put in the most rich and glorious vocabulary, I probably would have benefited, number one, from having a dictionary at my side, and number two, having a UK slang dictionary at my side.
that would have been
And
needed.
yet, I was 11 years old, and I love this book more than anything else in the world. Going back and looking at it now, having spent years reading to my kid, this is not at all the style that American children read in today in terms of vocabulary and in terms of focus and in terms of content. If I were to hand my kid this book at age 11, I mean, yes, she's read The Hunger Games, she's read a lot of gruesome stuff. I don't know if she would have any frame of reference for enjoying this book, because the way that it's written is so far outside of what is now this homogenized reading norm for American kids.
That's a shame. Yeah, I don't really know. I don't know my way around what the equivalent is over here for kids of that age now. I'm trying to think what is actually the last proper modern young person's fiction I've read. I guess Philip Pullman is, but maybe he's more young. What we call young adult fiction, I guess. Is that the same term both sides of the Atlantic? Is that what comes after Z
Yeah,
stroke Z?
that's an embarrassing question, because I have two friends who are both. Actually, no, I've got three friends who are published YA novelists. One of whom has put several Doctor Who references into her works.
And it is the term is the same both sides of the Atlantic, isn't it? It doesn't have
Yeah,
it's not one of those ones with a different inflection over here.
I would consider YA, and again, I could be wrong. I'm just doing this off the cuff. I would consider YA to be like 13 to 16 rather than 5 through 9.
Right.
The YA books tend to have more adult content, and the YA section at the local Barnes and Noble literally takes up an entire wall of the store.
Yeah.
These books sell like hotcakes.
But yeah, am I right to put Philip Pullman in that term? I'm really blundering here because I don't really know how it's talked about.
I have not read Pullman. I know that I've seen his books. I would consider him YA, I guess.
I mean, there's it gets into a lot of metaphysical stuff, I suppose, particularly in his later ones. But maybe he writes to different ages too. But yeah, no, it's really not my field, so I don't know the right way of terming things. But there are words in this that I definitely would have gone to look up. I mean, like expostulation gets used at one point, and I don't remember
Yes.
doing so, but I'm pretty sure I would have reached for my mum's old family dictionary that we had. That was like this dictionary from the 1950s. It had an appendix of modern words at the end, and me and my brother and sister used to joke that had words like electricity in it because the book was so old that they didn't belong in the main part. It wasn't really quite that old, but yeah, I'm sure I had to go and look up expostulation. But Taurus was helpfully defined at least twice in it. Yeah. So, but in terms of the focus and the story, I was thinking, and particularly most recently listening to your Curse of Peladon episode. That well, okay, there's a as you're saying in that, that's a really strong example of an unusual example of Doctor Who doing a political parable, and I'm thinking Cybermen on the moon is just a monster romp. And then I started thinking, okay, it's the mid 60s. We've got this device, we've got this gravitron. It's controlling the climate of Earth, particularly for growing crops and for agriculture. This is a period where the UK is struggling to be let in to the common market and being turned down by De Gaulle was vetoing us. And here we are on a base. It's surprising and odd that it's set in space and there's no Americans there, because space is where Americans are. Every kid knows this in the 80s. In any science fiction, that's what you get. And the fact that it's an entirely European, a pan-European base, but with a British guy as leading it, might have just been nudging. I'm really stretching here. I don't think this really holds water, but I'm going for it anyway. The gravitron could be seen as the common agricultural policy of the common market in space, and it's showing us that if Britain joins in, we will end up in a leadership role, because that's when it was a hot issue of whether we would join or not. And I think that's the most tenuous thing I've ever tried to sell on a podcast. But there's a granule to it.
You convince me, and I'll tell you why. I'll give you 3 reasons why you convince me.
Mhm.
Number 1, I believe towards the end of the book there is an American character who has maybe 1 line of dialogue, and I think they refer to the base as Lone American. So that he would not have been on television because John Brandon had already gone back to the States after wrapping 10th Planet. But Davis does include 1 American character who has no displacement on the plot in the book. That's my recollection.
I missed
Secondly,
that.
I raised this point in one of my blog posts, and I think it was the blog post for this book, which I have written but have not yet recorded, even though if you're listening to this podcast, you'll have heard me read out the blog post first before this interview. I believe I made a sarcastic reference to why is international space control in Geneva rather than in, say, the country that actually pioneered space and put the first man on the moon, where the moon base happens to take place. And I don't know how many British astronauts in the event have actually walked on the moon the way that Hobson does. The third point, though, of course, is that Gerry Davis winds up in Los Angeles and winds up as an American film producer for the last 10 or 15 years of his life. And when he was commissioned to write the novelization of Celestial Toymaker, he actually farmed it out to one of his proteges, who was a young Canadian-American female TV scriptwriter who had done like an episode of Tales from the Dark Side, which was shot right here in New York City. So Davis later became an American, so to speak. So you figure he'd be a little more sensitive to that, and maybe that's why he included the American character for the novelization. As to the political point, in 1985, that would have made no sense to me at all. Looking at it now, and considering the Elizabeth Sandiford notion of psychochronography, it does make sense that if it was out there in the news, it would have worked its way into the story. So the fact that you have the British on the moon, which didn't happen in real life, running a European-based program, which they would not have been doing in 1967, that actually makes all the sense in the world, and I think you really are onto something here.
Okay. I'll stick with that then. You've made me, maybe I'm not as mad as I think I am, but thinking it, yeah, it just sort of chimes, doesn't it? And this is the first time we've had obviously the first time we've been to the moon in Doctor Who. I don't know how much of that has gone on in other science fiction on TV at that point. Quatermass never went to the moon. I think, does this suffer in fan popularity? Or not even popularity, but in terms of its importance, I think sometimes is overlooked because it just it nails the base under siege, the whole base under siege thing so perfectly. After we've had a couple of, it's not the first iteration, but certainly obviously the 10th planet. Although I've seen some people argue that the base in the 10th planet isn't technically under siege, but I don't quite see how that works. But yeah, it's arguable. But anyway, this is where base under siege is up there and is running as a Doctor Who format. How did we ever used to make Doctor Who's that weren't sometimes bases under siege? And then there's so many more of them that I think it sort of gets, I don't know, just overlooked really, or underappreciated for being so claustrophobic and having that horror feel. Because this book scared me. That's something I haven't said yet. When I was 8 and reading this book, it was spooky and scary, and then Polly is the only one who at first who knows what the Cybermen are. In retrospect, looking at it in context now, how long has it actually been for Polly since she was at the North Pole? I mean, there's been, well, Power of the Daleks is set over the course of a few nights, I think. The Highlanders probably a couple. I'm not sure about the Underwater Menace, but it's probably only about a week since she was at the North Pole being attacked by these things, maybe a bit more.
Highlanders goes back and forth from Culloden Moor to Inverness. You can assume that Highlanders probably takes place over a couple of weeks.
Okay, a bit long, but yeah.
And then, of course, you have all the missing adventures and past Doctor adventures and Big Finish stories that have been shoehorned in.
Yes.
So if you take that literally, it's probably been 10 years since the South Pole.
It's a lot longer now than it was in '67. Yeah, we can be sure of that.
Let's get back to this story's view of internationalism. There is one Afro-Caribbean character in the story, Ralph. And he, of course, is one of the first ones who was, well, he's not killed off, but he's quickly converted by the Cybermen and doesn't have a speaking part after episode 1. That would have been an unusual sight. Doctor Who had only just started to cycle in, actors of African descent, and they would soon ban them for the next 10 years after that. Otherwise, the idea of diversity in this story is strictly European diversity.
Yeah.
One Englishman, one Frenchman, one Swede, for example, which I guess from Davis's point of view, looking to what will become the European Union, that is diverse because it's all over Europe and not just a bunch of British character actors in a room. And then he goes to the point, and this doesn't get brought up on TV because of Patrick Barr, but in the book, and I referenced this earlier in the podcast, where I talk about the two main alien species in the book are Cybermen and Yorkshiremen. Hobson has a definite Yorkshire personality and accent in the book. Now, as a kid, I wouldn't have known where Yorkshire was on a map. It wouldn't have made sense to me. Now, of course, having watched decades worth of British television, it makes a lot more sense. And it makes Hobson in the book quite different than he was on television. But do you think that the book, or do you think that the story, I should say, is a good effort at portraying diversity, or is it just the entire world is run by white people, and the whitest of white people from Switzerland are running the international space racket?
I think it's the direction of travel with these things that I sort of look at, and that it's trying to broaden things a bit, So yeah, I think it is, because the 10th planet, was the base in the 10th planet entirely American, or was it a multinational? I know there's the United Nations and everything comes in, but the actual crew on the base, my memory is suddenly letting me down. I can't. Yeah.
Robert Beatty, Canadian, would have been the principal guest star. So Cutler definitely is American in the novelization, but I think Barclay and Dyson were both British.
And we have the Jamaican astronaut, of course.
Right, that's right. Williams.
Yeah.
Because you have the Australian astronaut who's called Bluey. So again, it's the same authors and the same international flavor, but again, international space control is inexplicably run out of Geneva rather than Houston.
Yeah. So I think that is an attempt to just it's not the fourth and plentiful British Empire. You could easily have had a script, and if a script had been written 10 years earlier, the zeitgeist of that period might have been to be more retro about doing something like that. But there's this whole thing about how Britain got over its got over implies completion. Britain used its development, its role in Europe as a way of beginning to get over its no longer having an empire, and I guess this slots into that transition and direction that at least we were once heading in.
And I should point out, for the sake of fairness, that in the 10th planet you have the one Italian guy who goes around saying "Mamma Mia," which is another ham-handed bit of diversity. All right, so we are coming to the end of our hour here. So the last point we should bring up is you talk about the scare content of the book. It is very violent, and I'm sitting here at age 11 reading this with the Cybermen breaking people's necks. Again, I'm not so sure that if you were to put this book into the American reading system now, that would fly.
That's
But
interesting.
it
Yeah,
didn't bother me
because
at
that's what I
all when I
like.
was 11 years old.
Yeah, yeah. And but the most horrifying thing of all is a thing that's unshown. It's that you don't see, but they haunted me. The ship that gets diverted into the sun by the Cybermen using the gravitron, the relief ship. Um, I could picture in my mind's eye the faces of everyone on that ship, and just as Polly says, "But that'll take weeks," or someone says, "That'll take weeks," and they say, "Yes," and they're all going to die, and then we just move on, and they're never mentioned again, that really haunted me, but it made me want to keep coming back to the book because did that really happen? I've got to read that again.
Well, you can assume now that the Doctor actually has control over the TARDIS. I'm sure there is a missing adventure or a big finish somewhere where the Doctor can just, 2,000 years later in his own personal timeline, materialize the TARDIS around that ship and bring everybody back to safety. But yeah, you're right. That is very uncompromising, and it really talks about the dangers of space travel because in the States, you had the Apollo tragedy in the mid 60s where the astronauts died on the launching pad during a test firing of the rockets. And then you had, before the book was written, but after the TV serial aired, you had the Apollo 13 near disaster, which later became a movie in and of itself, which happened the same week that Ambassadors of Death was telling a similar story on Doctor Who screens. So you have to have some sort of lip service to the danger of space travel. If you have an accident while driving a car, you pull your car to the side of the road. If you have the equivalent of a flat tire in space, you're dead.
Yeah.
So it's good for Davis to bring that up, but you're right. That had it definitely affected me when I was a kid. I've never forgotten that part either, for sure.
Yeah, and it sort of and these are things that paved the way for the Hinch. I think the Hinchcliffe horror era later looks back to these, and particularly Tomb of the Cybermen when they're looking for genres that, hey, we can do that. We can do Doctor Who can be one of those scary movies, can't it? Yeah.
Although Revenge of the Cybermen, which is nominally by Gerry Davis, probably does not have the same impact as this one does.
No, despite having cybermats, and you would have thought that because the one thing with these 7 foot tall Cybermen hiding in cupboards on a moon base at the center of this, I mean, this could be quite comical, and the fact that it isn't is a huge credit to it. It's just come to me that I assigned the wrong nationality to El Cameron earlier, didn't I? He's from Bermuda, not so yeah. What did I tell you about my memory? It catches up with me eventually. But yeah, that the Cybermats would have fitted in very well into this story, you'd think, but then it doesn't miss them. It's fine. They're these scary figures at the back of the food stores.
They were created for the next serial
Mm,
after this one, Tomb of the Cybermen. The big feature here is the Cybermen go from cloth to metal, which because they were cloth in 10th Planet, now they're entirely encased in metal. And nobody comments on the fact that their appearance has totally changed, and everyone recognizes them as Cybermen, even though
mm,
arguably they shouldn't because it's a totally different design aesthetic. But
yeah.
that is something we can discuss when we talk about the 10th Planet on this podcast, probably in another 2 months. So, Pete, we could easily go for 2 or 3 more hours talking about this book, but I do try to keep myself to a reasonable time limit that I have time to listen to. So this is a good, I think, logical jumping off point for us. We've talked about your role on Trap One and some of the episodes we've done together. Pete, where else can folks find you in the podcast universe or on Twitter or anywhere else where your name might be found for Doctor Who fans of goodwill?
Yeah, do look me up if you want to chat about Doctor Who. I am Prof underscore quite a mess on Twitter, and I'm cropping up on. There's a Blake Seven podcast that I think we mentioned earlier that I'm part of the gang who run that. That's called Maximum Power, and we're about our second. We're about to start on the second series of Blake Seven. Those episodes will start coming out soon. That's great fun. We all take turns. I'm not on that every week, and yeah. And look out for future Trap ones as well.
So maybe we'll overlap on one of those, and you can hear us both together on Trap One.
Yeah.
And what is your quite a prof quite a mess? But what is your Twitter name?
I'm afraid I've played games with it and tend to change it around. But it's usually Very Pete Lambert. Hilarious pun on sadly no relation, Verity Lambert.
That would have been quite a family connection had you been one of
I know,
the Verity
yeah.
Lamberts.
I could try to style that out, but no, sadly not. Sadly not.
Well, Pete, thanks so much for joining us. Looking forward to having you back on the show in the near future. Thank you
Lovely.
once again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hip, hip, hooray! Hooray! The super leader saved the day.
And just to address a point that Pete and I could not figure out on the fly in the middle of the interview, here in the States, after reading groups A through Z comes middle grade fiction, and then YA fiction is deemed to be ages 12 through 18. And now you know the rest of the story. Next time, a new body's like a new house, bound to take a little time to settle in. Next week, Doctor Who Literature gets its first repeat guest, and we're going to discuss a brand new Doctor, young Tom Baker, and the novelization of his debut story, called Robot, on TV, which was released hard on the heels of the original broadcast. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. I'm Jason, your host and editor and producer. Special thanks to my special guest, Pete Lambert. This podcast is brought to you by Anchor, and can also be found on Google Podcasts and Spotify, with my apologies to Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and you can also find me on the Trap One podcast from time to time. I write about Doctor Who on Twitter using the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's Dr. Who Pilgrimage. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Next week, Doctor Who and the Giant Robot from March 1975, and again joined by a very special guest. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.